Melanie Doucette always got up early, well before dawn, well before the sun began to break through the darkness of the night. She appreciated this fragile tranquility, this suspended moment when the city still seemed asleep, barely awake. His modest apartment, a two-room apartment located in a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, was an organized mess. The piles of files and reports which littered the living room table, the books left open on the sofa, bore witness to the bustling life of a woman constantly on the move, juggling between her professional and family responsibilities. She shared this space with her younger sister, Amélie, who was still in a coma after a car accident 2 years earlier. Melanie had taken care of Amélie since the accident, getting up every day to help her, but it wasn't just the family she cared for. It was also about a much larger, much more complex and often unfair world, where every action, every movement, carried extra weight because of one's skin color. The first rays of light filtered through the fringed curtains, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. Melanie, her eyes still tired but determined, slowly got up from the bed. She stood up quietly, as if trying not to disturb the world still sleeping around her. She removed the blanket in one smooth motion, her thoughts already focused on the day ahead of her. A day like any other, and yet, a day that would change his life. Looking in the mirror gave him a familiar image, but today it seemed more marked, as if the accumulation of trials left indelible traces. Her face, soft but firm, her steely gaze, seemed to speak of an inner struggle, the one she fought every day. Melanie was not just a black woman in a world of men and hierarchy. She wasn't just an FBI agent. No, she was a fighter, a survivor. The challenges she faced were multiple, extensive, and often invisible to those around her. Her talent was not only tested by the criminals she tracked, but also by the invisible barriers of a world where skin color was often seen as a sign of weakness or distrust. She quickly put on a simple but effective outfit: dark pants, a sober shirt, and over that, a discreet gray coat. She adjusted her black cap to hide her neatly styled hair, an attempt at anonymity. That morning, she didn't want to be noticed. She had a clear objective, an undercover mission in a high-risk neighborhood, a place where gangs, drug dealers, and thugs of all kinds reigned supreme. His role there was to blend in, to reveal nothing, to never attract attention. It was her specialty, her gift, and she knew it. But what put her even more on alert was the fact that this kind of mission carried enormous risks. Risks not only from criminals, but also from a system which, even under the best trappings, remained plagued by prejudices and inequalities. Today, she had to hide once again, but this time, reality was going to catch up with her more brutally than ever. She walked out of the apartment into the silence of dawn, the cool air caressing her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The familiar sounds of the city began to be heard: the first cars driving by, the birds singing in the trees, the murmurs of the street waking up. Everything seemed ordinary. But Melanie knew that, as always, the orders, the rules, and especially the looks, would be harsher than ever in this neighborhood. As she crossed the neighborhood's main street, her gaze paused for a moment on the decrepit buildings and graffiti that littered the walls, silent witnesses to the many stories of struggle and resistance in this forgotten corner of the city. It was not a place where she felt safe. But she knew this was where she was supposed to be. Little did she know that this place was going to become much more than just a decoration. It was going to become a scene where the truth would come to light, with all the weight it carried. The sound of a car engine startled her. Melanie turned her head and saw a police car slowing down in her direction. Agent Lefebvre, a man in his 30s with a hard look and quick gestures, stared at her through his windshield. Melanie felt a shiver run through her, a familiar sensation that chilled her spine. She was no stranger to scrutinizing glances and hasty judgments, but there was something particularly threatening in Lefebvre's. He had no idea who she was, but he had already made up his mind. A judgment based on nothing other than appearance. The vehicle suddenly stopped right next to her. Lefebvre lowered the window with a mechanical gesture, without a word, but his gaze did not leave her. Melanie, despite her training, felt palpable tension. He hadn't even bothered to ask a question, or question her to find out what she was doing in this neighborhood. He was already convinced that she was guilty of something, that she belonged to this world of mistrust and danger, just because of the color of her skin. "Hey, you there," he said in a dry, almost authoritarian tone. "What are you doing in this corner?" Melanie, who knew better than anyone that a wrong answer could degenerate into a violent confrontation, chose her words with meticulous precision. His voice, calm but firm, echoed in the cool morning air, almost frozen by the tension already building between them. "I'm just going to the market." But she had no idea that this simple sentence, spoken in the detached tone of a person used to managing tensions, would be enough to excite Agent Lefebvre, already on alert. Lefebvre, with furrowed eyebrows and a visibly irritated look, got out of his vehicle with almost impulsive speed. He walked towards her, each step emphasizing an unconscious distrust, a gaze that scrutinized her as if every gesture, every movement she made was an indication of guilt. Melanie, always calm, did not expect this sudden escalation. For no apparent reason, he walked towards her and, with a sudden movement, grabbed her arm, squeezing harder than necessary. "You're not from here. You are suspicious." His words were heavy with prejudice, with this invisible burden that Melanie carried at every moment, every gesture, every encounter. The color of his skin alone seemed enough for Lefebvre to associate him with a world he did not know, with a threat he had already imagined. There was a silent violence in this sentence, as if, by her very presence, Melanie had broken a rule that he had never questioned. Melanie, frozen for a moment by the brutality of the hold, felt invaded by a wave of shock. How could a police officer act like this, without proof, without even trying to understand? But she knew what to do. She breathed slowly, her body trying to relax despite the intensity of the moment. She raised her arm slightly to avoid the pain that Lefebvre could inflict on her, but she did not let fear dominate her. She couldn't let instinct carry her away. She had to stay in control. "I'm an FBI agent. You are making a serious mistake." Her words were spoken calmly, but the tension was palpable in the voice she chose. She knew that in this situation every word could be misinterpreted, but she had no choice. She had to make it understood. Her badge remained hidden in her pocket, and yet everything inside her screamed that she had to show it off, without hesitation. Lefebvre, however, was far too carried away by his own certainty to listen to him. He raised his voice, the words becoming more and more venomous. "You think you can get away with this? You are guilty, there is no doubt." The certainty in his words had something chilling, as if, in his mind, Melanie was already just one suspect among many others, a figure to be stereotyped. His accusations, unfounded, echoed in the hot air of the street, and Melanie felt the pressure increase. She knew that everything could degenerate in an instant, that this confrontation was just a bad move on her part by Lefebvre, a small spark, and violence could erupt. Passers-by, attracted by the noise and tension, began to stop, their curious eyes focused on the scene that was unfolding. A few phones were out, capturing every movement, every gesture. Others were whispering among themselves, some undecided, others already certain of what they were seeing. Melanie felt like the object of these glances, as if her life had just been transformed into a spectacle. She knew that the crowd was also a pressure, a force that would push even harder on Agent Lefebvre's shoulders, but also on her. The scene was being played out, and she was part of it, despite herself. "It's not going to happen like that," she thought with determination. Melanie knew that every gesture of resistance could be used against her. If she responded to violence with violence, Lefebvre could always justify her excess of force. But she couldn't stay there, in the grip of this brutal embrace, and do nothing. She looked for another way. In a slow, calculated movement, she took out her FBI badge, and with a confident hand, she brandished it under Agent Lefebvre's nose. His arm was firm, his gesture authoritative, his face impassive. She had the intuition that this gesture, this simple gesture, could change the situation. She did it with the precision of a movement she had made 1,000 times in her career, and yet each second seemed to stretch in the heavy air. "Look carefully." His voice, which was calm but powerful, echoed clearly in the space around them. "I am Melanie Doucette. I work for the FBI, and I'm on assignment here." These words were like an incantation, a truth that she imposed, but she also knew that in Lefebvre's eyes, It would probably have no importance. Lefebvre looked at her, his eyes hardening further, but he didn't seem to react immediately. A moment of doubt crossed his eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. He took a step back, as if to give himself space, but instead of releasing his grip, he stood on his legs, his hands clenched into fists. He raised his voice once again, his words laced with disdain and contempt. "Do you really think I'm going to believe that?" he said, a mocking sneer stretching his lips. "It's always the same excuse." His tone carried the resentment of those who, over time, had formed a conviction about what was right and what was not. His prejudices, like invisible armor, seemed to protect his view of the world. The weight of his words, heavy and sharp, made Melanie waver for a moment. But she stood up. Every word from Lefebvre, every contemptuous look he gave her was like a frontal attack, but Melanie did not give in. She stood straight, her shoulders stiff, her eyes fixed on those of Lefebvre. She knew this moment was more than just an altercation. It wasn't just a question of legitimacy. It was a battle, a fight against ingrained prejudices, against a system which, even under the guise of a modern and just society, never ceased to remind Melanie that she always had to prove her place. She wasn't going to give in. No, here on this noisy street, she was going to be loud. Not for herself, but for everyone who, every day, found themselves in situations like this. And if that day, in that street, she had to fight for her dignity, for her mission, then she would do it whatever the cost. Suddenly, the sound of a police car was heard in the street. Melanie turned her head, hoping that it was a passerby who came to help, but on the contrary, another police officer quickly came forward. It was Captain Julien, a man in his 40s, tall and imposing, but with a calmer and more measured look than that of Lefebvre. He had a reputation for respecting the rules and knowing the limits of his power. Although he never worked directly with Melanie, he knew her by name and her status as an FBI agent. He had heard about her rigor, her commitment, and the respect she inspired in her colleagues. He was not one to judge in haste, and when he saw the scene unfolding, he knew immediately that he had to intervene. Quickly approaching Agent Lefebvre, he made a gesture to stop him, in an authoritarian but calm tone. "Lefebvre, you have crossed the line again. It's Melanie Doucet, an FBI agent." Captain Julien's words rang out like a clap of thunder, and the crowd watching the scene froze. The murmurs, which were already omnipresent, turned into exclamations and whispers filled with surprise and disbelief. Many of them couldn't believe what they had just heard. Melanie, even though she felt like a weight on her shoulders, felt a strange relief invade her. She was no longer simply this black woman confronted with unjust authority, but the agent of a powerful institution, protected by its own legitimacy. However, the situation did not calm down. Agent Lefebvre, whose arrogance had until now been displayed with total certainty, found himself overwhelmed by the revelation. Recognizing the mistake he had just made was not self-evident. His rage boiled inside him, fueled by the public humiliation and the fact that his own colleague had just disowned him. He tried to justify himself, but his words were in vain. The crowd, which had grown larger as the minutes passed, began to murmur with greater fervor. The looks of passers-by, at first full of curiosity, were now filled with judgment. The smartphones were aimed at him, capturing his denial and his helplessness. Lefebvre, who until then had imposed his will without scruple, found himself in a vulnerable position. But instead of simply recognizing his mistake and submitting to Captain Julien's authority, Lefebvre reacts as if he was not yet aware of the seriousness of his actions. "Do you really think I'm going to believe that?" he said in a trembling but arrogant voice. "She's just trying to get by. It's a scam." Melanie, for her part, remained motionless, her face impassive but marked by a mixture of disgust and sadness. She did not feel pride in this moment of victory, but heavy bitterness. What was happening before her was a reflection of a much larger, more deeply rooted system. It was not just Lefebvre's fault, it was a broader failure, that of a society where the authority of the police could crush without consequence the lives of those they deemed unworthy, simply because of their skin color. The increasingly dense crowd now constituted a collective force which placed direct pressure on Lefebvre. The looks of his colleagues, his peers, forced him to become aware of his behavior. The scene was almost theatrical. The angry looks, the phones aimed at him, the palpable tension between the captain and his subordinate. Lefebvre tried to regain control, but the recognition of his mistake was already too late for him to pretend that he had done nothing wrong. The chaos of the situation did not end with an outburst of anger, but with a heavy, almost solemn silence. After the incident, local newspapers reported the events with harrowing headlines, describing the scene as a stark illustration of systemic racism within law enforcement. Melanie, although she never sought to be a public figure, found herself caught in a media whirlwind. In spite of herself, she had become a symbol of resistance, a voice in the fight for more justice. But she knew it wasn't fame that brought her here, or even public recognition. That day, she was confronted with the cruelty of a system which, in its way of dehumanizing, ignored the complexity of individuals. And she knew it was her responsibility to keep fighting. For Melanie, Lefebvre's suspension and the opening of an investigation were important results, but they were not enough to erase the deep scars left by the incident. What she experienced that day was not a simple mistake. It was a call to action. A cry for justice, for equality, and for an end to impunity. She knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. She wasn't just an FBI agent. She was now a living symbol of resistance, dignity, and the fight against systemic injustice. And his mission had just taken a decisive turning point.